And we're live. Welcome to this evening's live stream, Education or Indoctrination, Ethnic Studies in K through 12. We've got a lot to speak about, so I'm going to get us started right away. Today we have Alina Kaplan with us. She is the president of the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, and she has been at the forefront of the ethnic studies discussions happening in California and California policy. We have Brandy Shufutinsky with us. She is a social worker, educator, researcher. She is a part of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, as well as the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, both of which are sponsoring this live stream. And finally, we have Michael David Cobb Bowen, who is a Stoic writer, a data engineer, founder of the Conservative Brotherhood, and co founder of Free Black Thought, who is also sponsoring our live stream tonight. With me moderating is David Bernstein, the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and co founder of the Institute of Liberal Values. And I am Jennifer Richmond, co founder of the Institute of Liberal Values and community coordinator for the Moral Courage Project. So, with that, before we get started, one of the principles of the Institute of Liberal Values is that we enter into dialogue in good faith and we approach different views with curiosity and humility. And hopefully, at the end of this live stream today, we will be able to take questions from the audience. So, we invite you with those principles in mind to ask questions into the live stream ourselves, and we will get to those towards the end. So, with no further ado, David, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this program. Do you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm seeing myself in a delayed way. I'm sorry about that. So I'm really excited to help moderate this panel. These are really important issues around um, ethnic studies and how ethnic studies are being taught in schools around the country, and what we're likely to see in other states, just as we saw in California in the now and in the past. So I'm going to start us off with a basic question. What are your concerns about this popularized form of ethnic studies that we saw in California K through 12 and that we might be seeing in other states? And why don't I start with you, Alina Kaplan?
Great. First of all, big thank you both to you, David, and to Jennifer and to ILB for hosting this super important conversation. And before I answer that very first question, I wanted to provide just a bit of background. So ACES, short for Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, is a non-partisan grassroots coalition, and we're working to remove basically narrow ideological agendas from ethnic studies. We believe in constructive ethnic studies curriculum, and this is a curriculum that builds bridges, inspires mutual respect, confronts racism, celebrates ethnic accomplishments. In short, this is basically everything that most Americans that haven't heard the term would assume it means. So when we first started out, informally about 2 years ago, formally about a year ago, we assumed that working with ethnic studies meant a relatively narrow focus. After all, we were talking about a one semester course in high school in public and charter schools. As it turned out, it ended up being a much broader subject in the context of today's K-12 education. So first of all, we'll probably be talking about this. California just passed a law mandating ethnic studies as a graduation requirement. The state-approved model curriculum for ethnic studies explicitly encourages schools to integrate ethnic studies into all grades across all subjects. How that's done is a separate conversation that hopefully we'll get into during the Q&A. Now, other states, as David alluded to, are following suit, as generally happens with California curricula. And so, as it turns out, the impact of the type of ethnic studies is quite deep and broad. So we'll stick with California for a minute. In California, there was this bill called AB 2016 that was passed to mandate the development of an ethnic studies model curriculum. And its goal, its stated objective, was to prepare students to be global citizens and to foster, quote, an appreciation for the contributions of multiple cultures. Okay, so far so good. I think that there are few of our listeners today that would argue with that general objective. Unfortunately, that objective effectively got hijacked by a very specific brand of ethnic studies. And that's what, David, you were referring to when you say popularized ethnic studies. It turns out that there is a very specific discipline on college campuses called critical ethnic studies, and the professors in this field call themselves scholar activists. In other words, they very openly say that yes, they have a political agenda and that they are activists at least as much as they are scholars. The practitioners of this discipline say that they aim to quote, I'm quoting here, so I'm going to go slowly because this is really important, bring into conversation the ways that concerted efforts and collectivized resistance to US imperialism ground our approaches for dismantling the neo-colonial schooling apparatus, unquote. Phew. Okay, so now compare that. Think about the comparison of that to what the objective originally was, right? Remember, prepare students to be global citizens and foster an appreciation for contributions of multiple cultures. However, based on this objective and based on these scholar activists that effectively hijacked the curriculum, this is how we ended up with a highly controversial initial draft of the ethnic studies model curriculum. And after a bunch of edits to it, this group that offered this original draft, these critical ethnic studies leaders, saw some particular changes that were not to their liking, and they formed their own group, propagating their own curriculum, and that is the curriculum that is the main one that is making its way through California today. It's referred to as either critical ethnic studies, liberated ethnic studies, CRT-based ethnic studies, any of those. Okay, so as it turns out, there are two different types of ethnic studies, and there's lots in between, but we can think of them as having two different approaches. One is this critical liberated approach, which is the one that we have concerns about, and that one emphasizes an oppressor victim paradigm. So the world is divided into victims and oppressors. It promotes a specific ideology and a movement to, quote, challenge imperialistic, colonial, hegemonic beliefs and practices. That's what you saw in their objective. And it glorifies militant resistance as a means to social change. On the other hand, there's a constructive ethnic studies, and that's what I was referring to when I was talking about what ACES promotes, the idea that the best, and this is the one that we would think most Americans would support and even assume, and that's one that builds bridges of understanding, focuses on ethnic group contributions and accomplishments, and exposes students to lots of perspectives, different perspectives. I think the best way to grasp the difference here is to look at a couple of images. So Jen, could we go to the first slide on the first PowerPoint slide so I could share with folks? Okay. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see this. You can see the first one. It's kind of a tapestry. You get a sense of, the image gives you a sense of general multicultural tapestry, right? And then you have the second one where there's an image of a pyramid and a guy with his arm at the top, up at the top, and you can see the sense that it's evoking a sense of revolution. So you can get a sense for the different approaches. I also wanted to share another one that I came across very recently, and this is still in the critical liberated ethnic studies mode. Jen, can we go to the next one? So check this out. I kind of did a double take when I saw this. They recently changed their cover. This is a seminal foundational text of critical ethnic studies called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's written by a neo-Marxist activist named Paulo Freire. And it talks about how the oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. And so this is a foundational principle. But take a look at that image. It's in the form of a rifle with a pencil on top. So again, kind of gives you a sense of what we're talking about here. Okay, Jen, we can stop sharing for a few minutes. Thank you. And then we'll come back. So I can summarize my concerns to bring this back around. I can summarize my concerns with critical ethnic studies in basically three categories. One, the idea of dividing the world into two very precise boxes, victim and oppressor. Placing humans into any boxes, but especially these, cannot lead to anything good. And this is not what we want to be teaching the next generation. It's not good for the students that are labeled oppressors. It's not good for the students that are labeled victims. And instead of teaching understanding, empathy, respect, you end up breeding resentment, fear, and actually more racism. And later on, we can talk about how this plays out in the classroom, including a Cuban boy being told by a teacher that he's not a real Latino because he says they fled communism and socialism, and being told by his fellow friends, by his friends on the playground, that they won't pass the ball to him because he has white privilege. This is a boy with light skin. Okay, so we got one, dividing the world into these categories. Two, inculcating a very specific narrow ideology. Specifically in this case, it's neo-Marxism. The ideology of critical ethnic studies is based on that of the Third World Liberation Front, which, if you're not familiar with, justly fought for including communities of color in higher education. However, they also argued, and this ideology also argued, that, quote, it is up to us to make the revolution, to break the system, to smash it, shatter it, and destroy it, as Brother Lenin said, unquote. Now, the critical ethnic studies movement very openly says that it is based on the Third World Liberation Front ideology and movement. In teacher trainings for critical ethnic studies, when trainers are asked about these explicit Marxist concepts, the trainers acknowledge that some teachers may find this difficult, but explain that they must have the correct political views in order to teach the subject. One way we see the ideology is through the role models that are highlighted in the curriculum. And so we have, remember, the liberal ethnic studies ideology drove the initial curricula of the model curriculum. So we end up with 154 role models of color, including a preponderance of neo-Marxist and/or violent figures. We've got Oscar Lopez Rivera as a role model, who was the leader of the Marxist-Leninist organization that carried out over 130 US bombings. Just the list goes on and on. But important also is who is missing. So for instance, we have an entire African-American section without Martin Luther King, without John Lewis, without Rosa Parks, without Thurgood Marshall. In fact, they're also missing are civil rights leaders altogether, described in one reading as being passive, quote unquote, and docile. So that's two. Three, the extent to which so much of this is going under the radar. A component of the Liberate Ethnic Studies curriculum specifically instructs teachers that when needed, they should fly under the radar with specific parts of ethnic studies. And teachers are told that they have to be careful because classes are online now sometimes, and parents can overhear the content and misinterpret it. Again, nothing good can come from curricula that must fly under the radar. So that summarizes the issues, that summarizes what the concerns are. My partner, my colleague, Brandy, will talk a little bit about what we can do instead, and the idea of a constructive ethnic studies curriculum that focuses on building bridges, uniting students around solving challenges, including confronting racism, celebrating ethnic accomplishments, and doing all this without placing them into boxes and promoting a specific ideology, specifically neo-Marxism and violent movements. So I will pause there and turn it over to the others.
Okay, so Brandy, you're up.
Can you hear me okay? Check that first. Okay. Thank you for hosting this and moderating, Jen and David, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So when we talk about ethnic studies, we're talking about interdisciplinary fields, And you'll hear a lot of ethnic studies academics discuss what constitutes real ethnic studies, discounting the expertise of others in favor of their own ideology. So I view teaching through my lens as a social worker, where knowledge is fundamentally rooted in two things. First, facts. Historical and current events are not about someone's version of the truth. History and current events just are. Certain things happened or are happening that cannot be disputed, even as some attempt to twist or erase events. In behavioral health, that's referred to as gaslighting. Second, feeling, how individuals and groups feel about what happened or is happening. And both of these are foundational aspects of ethnic studies, cultural facts and feelings about events. So the first aspect should be relatively easy for an educator to navigate. Present factual materials, make those materials as inclusive and diverse as possible. The second aspect is where we're experiencing division, where having conversations about how individuals feel about events brings in a lot of other things, like defensiveness, overreactions, erasure of certain experiences if they do not align with certain ideologies. In other words, biases. This is also where we have to ask, whose feelings matter in the classroom? Is there a hierarchy? Should teachers allow their students to know where they align? And I'll address the last question first. No, I don't think it's appropriate for a K-12 teacher to express their feelings about events, at least not to the point where students are impacted by those feelings. It's not fair for students to feel coerced or pressured to support a teacher's opinions or ideology. And this is the point where education can turn into indoctrination. As to the other two questions about whose feelings matter, when we're discussing K-12 students, the answer should be that, the adults should consider all students' feelings. And that doesn't mean that we should censor difficult content or minimize facts. It does mean that there should be space made for students to learn without fear of judgment or repercussions. So my concerns are centered around the politicization of education, where one ideology is presented as the only truth, and those who disagree are painted with a virtual scarlet letter. It's unfortunate when any fringe extreme begins to overtake the rational majority, and it's unfortunate that education has not been spared this. I'm concerned that learning will recede and indoctrination, akin to what occurs under authoritarian regimes, replaces it. Even though this ideology proclaims itself progressive, it has all the markings of authoritarianism. George Orwell stated this. He said, "The frightening thing about totalitarianism is that it attacks the concept of objective truth. It claims to control the past as well as the future. Analytical thinking and questioning are the food source of curiosity, without which liberalism will die." The encouraging part of this conversation is that it's not a zero-sum game. We don't need to accept that in order to learn real history or real ethnic studies, we have to accept an ideology that flirts with illiberalism. We can encourage schools to implement constructive ethnic studies curricula, which Alina spoke about, and that's where students have space to question and analyze information while confronting issues that impact us all.
Okay, great. Mike, your take. Mike, you're muted. So let's unmute.
Sorry. Thanks for having me here. I'm really glad that we have this alternative channel to reach as many people as possible to clarify some things. My primary concern is a narrowing of the ideas of what African Americans can be, have been, could be. I'll start out with a quote. Perhaps the supreme irony of Black American existence is how broadly Black people debate the question of cultural identity among themselves while getting branded as a cultural monolith by those who would deny us the complexity and complexion of a complex community, let alone a nation. If Afro-Americans have never settled for the racist reductions imposed upon them, from chattel slaves to cinematic stereotype to sociological myth, it is because Black people themselves not only knew better, but knew more than enough ethnic diversity within themselves to subsume those fictions. That is by Greg Tate, a writer from the Village Voice, back in the 90s. And I was very impressed by that because I had to come to grips myself with Black diversity. And I think these woke ideologies, wherever they're coming from, are moving us in a dumbing down of our society, from the soft bigotry of low expectations to an ideological position with no expectations. And I see that in 4 or 5 different ways. First of all, there's no expectation of us to have an international consciousness. Even the Black nationalist movement had some Pan-African sentiments. So we were thinking, well, not only what's going on in America in our politics, but what's going on in Ghana, but what's going on in Brazil. So there was a broader take on what all of us might have to go through by looking at specific organizations and specific things that other people were doing. And as we all know, Malcolm X certainly changed his philosophy upon going international. Secondly, I think we are having no expectations of our own prior politics and our own prior cultures. So I'm old enough to know that I was born as a Negro. And we talked about the Negro problem in those days. And then we had Black arts and Black consciousness and Black nationalism. And then a segment of African-American society went in that direction. There was an Afro-American moment. Now we're dealing, in order to explode the monolith, that's why we invented African-American, because it wouldn't make sense to talk about Black people in the 1800s. And now we're dealing with a new terminology, BIPOC, which I have problems with. But then again, this is something that's constantly in motion. So if we're going to just say all Black people should, then we're doing a disservice there. I think there are no expectations outside of these ideologies of class distinctions. And so if we're to be reduced to a race, that means upper middle class or upper class will all be treated as we are oppressed or in poverty. And that may have made sense in 1955 before Brown versus Board of Education, when most Negroes were in poverty. But now that's somewhere around 12 to 15% of 46 million people. So we have certainly more people in the middle class of African Americans than there were total Negroes 60 years ago. We don't talk about religious distinctions. And these are things that people take more seriously among African Americans, as Protestants, as Baptists, as Methodists, as African Methodist Episcopals. My family is both Catholic and Episcopalian on my father's side, Catholic on my mother's side. And I let my kids choose which church they wanted to go to. So even within one family, there's a diversity that's not addressed by these ideologies. I think the most difficult thing for me is dealing with the idea that we have no agency because we should be looked at as a group. And that's, if you're a cat and you sit in a box, then you've herded yourself. But we should be 46 million people incapable of being herded. And so as these ideologies slip under the radar, people are going to expect us to be in these boxes. And we should be more wildcats than that. A geographical distribution. My father's from Connecticut. My mother's from Louisiana. My wife is from Michigan. My son was born in Brooklyn. My daughters were born in Georgia. And we live in California. All of those are different, various places. And every place is not like Compton. And we don't have the attitude like Ice Cube and NWA. So we should not be reduced. And I can just say there is more to African American diversity than is dreamt of in these woke ideologies. We are not all spoken for.
Thank you, Mike. So let's go to a question here. There's a couple good questions. I want to direct this one to Alina, who's really our resident guru of the California AB 101 guardrails. What the AB 101 guardrails? Those are the guardrails that were put in to prevent California from taking the path of sort of the most extreme versions, anti-Semitic versions of the curriculum. Would they would they prevent these schools from? Would they make these schools stay on the path of constructive ethnic studies? If not, why not?
Hi, Joe. Thanks for the question. So this is a complicated question, and it has multiple aspects. On the one hand, as we have been and will be talking about, ethnic studies can be a really positive thing. On the other hand, having 7 different guardrails, which is what AB 101 currently has, in order to try to keep things on the straight and narrow, is concerning. And we want to make sure that the intent of AB 101, which is to make sure that students are learning the type of ethnic studies that brings them together, that builds bridges, that the intent of AB 101 is actually carried out. I think of the guardrails as only as good as the guards, and that's why we need everybody on everybody tracking, everybody keeping a lookout, everybody involved in ensuring that we are implementing in schools the kind of ethnic studies that AB 101 envisioned and that the law originally envisioned. So does it guarantee anything? No. I think that there's really nothing that can guarantee a constructive curriculum or really any curriculum. Does it help? Yes, they are tools for all of us that are in the positions to be able to stay on top and that means everybody. That means every parent, every voter, to stay on top of what's happening in the individual schools and the districts, and to demand, to insist that they get the information they need, and that things are, if they are not going the way that they should be in terms of constructive ethnic studies, that they change. That's the short answer.
While I have you up there, we'll broaden this in just a moment. You know, it's amazing that the word critical race or the phrase critical race theory hasn't popped up yet. Where does it fit in all this?
Great question. So we actually have conversations about this all the time internally about the extent to which we want to be talking about critical race theory, honestly, because the issue is not critical race theory in and of itself. Critical race theory is a legal theory. It's been around forever and ever. It's been taught in law schools among lots of different theories, including, by the way, other race theories. The issue is taking that theory, that very particular theory, pushing it down into K through 12, not even talking about college, into K through 12, and then making it at the lens through which a topic, in this case, ethnic studies, is taught. So we haven't been talking about it, but it's underlying. So when we talk about critical ethnic studies, yes, that word critical is the same as the critical in critical race theory. Critical theory, critical race theory, critical ethnic studies, these are all connected and they have a common thread going through them. Don't know if that answers the question, David, but I'm sure there will be more on that same topic.
Sure. Brandy, do you want to add anything to that?
I just want to say that the conversation and debate has kind of been hijacked, where it's pitting one side saying we can't teach critical race theory to kids, and the other side saying we're not teaching critical race theory. And as Alina pointed out, it's one theory and framework. It's not the teaching of the theory, like the teaching of the theory of relativity. Is that the question really is that the lens that the subjects are being taught through? Because that's a whole different dynamic. If any type of critical theory is the only lens that information is presented through, it leads to a lot of the erasure that Mike spoke about just a few minutes ago.
And David, if I might add, now Brandy just made me think of one thing that's worth pointing out, which is that that term has become so politicized that it's almost lost all meaning and all original meaning, and it's taken on a life of its own. So when I say that we talk about among ourselves, how much do we want to talk about this? It's because, what do you talk about? Do you talk about what it originally was supposed to be? Do you talk about what's morphing into? Do you talk about what it's going to morph into? And so it's turned into this political football of either left or right, when in reality, we're talking about a topic that should have absolutely nothing to do with left or right. And when we think about the idea that that critical race theory, abbreviated as CRT, means talking about racism or talking about history honestly, that becomes completely nonsensical, because those things are not synonymous, and you absolutely can and should address history honestly and address racism. That does not mean that you need to believe in or promote CRT.
Great. Mike, want to add anything there?
Only that I, from my own experience coming up with a scientific background, had to look at the arts and try to understand what's going on there. And as I read through various folks, I asked, what's next? So in the 90s, I was reading Cornel West, and there was a book called The American Invasion of Philosophy that helped me a lot. And I learned about various philosophers who are American. And I said, oh, okay, it's clear. Everything that I want is within these philosophers. And I said, what's next? And all the answers that I got were towards this neo-Marxist position. So I would hear about Marcuse, I would hear about the postmodernists. And as I had previously studied the Tao from Japan, I was wondering why all of these European intellectuals were on the left side. And so I couldn't find out for many years later that there were conservatives that might be interesting to me and to broader aspects of society. But it was just like, well, you're a black person, you must be oppressed. You want to read Paulo Freire. You want to read the critical folks. So yeah, I had to go through Crenshaw and Lord and Aldonzua and that set of thinkers before I could get to something else, because presumptions were made about what I was going to use knowledge for. And I think it's the same thing that's going to be foisted on K through 12 unless we act.
Great. Thank you. Let's go on. So we talk a lot about these ideologies, whether we call it critical race theory, whether we call it critical social justice, some of us do, whether we call it wokeness, which may or may not be pejorative depending on who you ask. How is this ideology proliferating in society and in your communities, and what effect is it having? Why don't I start with Mike?
Okay, sure. Thanks. Well, since I'm an engineer and in IT specifically, I happen to work with folks from around the world all the time. On my team, we have folks from Colombia and Venezuela. We have Russians. We have Indians. We have folks of all different backgrounds in a corporate setting. Once I was with a small company, now I'm with a larger company. And we all speak the same language, which is the logic of programming languages. And that's how we communicate. It's universal. And I think about that also, if we could read music, that too is universal. And we share those things. But we're under a kind of strange kind of threat, which goes beyond K through 12 education, which is the way that we inculcate certain ethics, and the critical studies are part of this, into corporate governance. And so people who are in other countries working with us in America are subject to, for example, our sexual harassment guidelines. And so with CRT, there's also DEI, diversity, things that have conceptualized and are getting more and more concrete in corporate work. And there's also ESG with ethical social governance, which are guidelines that are making investors put their money into this company rather than that company. And of course, there are diversity points that are kept track of. And so people who don't have the context of American culture or no other way to understand this either because of language or just because they don't understand American culture, are subject to these growing international rules. So this is another place that a woke ideology is finding root in terms of the way that we negotiate all things in business between each other. And so it's a very strange thing to have worked in Germany, Italy, Australia, Colombia, myself, and most of the major cities in America without these kinds of guidelines, to see them creeping in as a part of the way that personnel has changed to human resources, and they have more and more influence on the way we communicate with each other or should not communicate with each other. And a lot of this is for the better. We certainly don't want to have sexual harassment and a hurtful workplace. And these are things that have done well. But there are these other ways of creeping forward that are not integrative. So I grew up when affirmative action based on the Bakke decision was kind of the status quo. And we all kind of agreed during the 80s after the Bakke decision that this is the way to go forward. And that made a difference in corporate settings. It made a sense in academic settings. And there were a series of decisions that came after that where we gradually spun into the term of diversity. And we just assumed that ethnic diversity would be intellectual diversity. And there have been various corruptions of multiculturalism, from my perspective, that are now transparently racial. So when we talk about anything like cultural appropriation, these are things that have impact beyond the classroom in the world of work. And so it's dangerous to see these ideologies shape the way that people are hired, and they have to have kind of a second education, not only to know what the subject matter is that you're supposed to be responsible as a professional, as an employee, but these new regimes that keep changing the way that we must communicate with each other, and who has a priority in hiring, and if you're a DEI officer, you're making big money. So this is already monetized in major corporations, and especially in my field in IT. And we've seen how those controversies boil over at Google with the Damore letter, and in other companies as well. So we all in business and in international business, we have our own problems and difficulties, and added onto that with these ideological battles in the context of the American culture wars is a burden on all of our international partners. And it's getting in the way of us doing our jobs well. And that's something that I see. I would add that I'm fortunate to have grown up in Los Angeles. When people see the Crenshaw community that I grew up in, represented in Hollywood movies, they don't often know that there are Japanese ethnics as well as blacks there. And I've seen how many Asians are stereotyped, where in the rest of the country, you just don't have all of the communities that we have here. And it's kind of sad that it becomes black and white. It becomes a Jew and Gentile, when there's so much other individuals out there within various groups that get left out. And so that's what ideology does. It flattens everything, and it forces us to deal with each other out of these boxes. And that's not natural, and it's not constructive. So I hope that we're able to see beyond that. And I hope we can continue to talk about these things openly and honestly, because we can't write some of these things in stone.
Thank you, Mike. Brandy, how do you see these ideologies playing out sort of in everyday life?
So there's been a real strong tendency to either overstate or understate the impact that support for narrow ideological viewpoints has on individuals and communities. And you have each side claiming that if we don't embrace their ideology over all others, then it spells doom and gloom for generations to come. However, I believe they're missing the mark with that argument. The main issue with wokeness or critical or liberated ethnic studies is its lack of viewpoint diversity. Now, some will say that there are no two sides to every issue or event, and I agree. There are certain horrific events that should be called out for what they were or what they are wrong. The state of Texas right now is giving us two examples of this. The first being that teacher who recently called for both sides of the Holocaust to be taught in the classroom. And the second is this Texas State Senate banning the requirement to teach students about that the Ku Klux Klan was morally wrong. And unfortunately, that's not what's happening with this ideology. It doesn't stop there. Instead, it preaches that everyone has to feel the same way, and not about horrible events, but about everything in order to be right. So it only presents one way of being, which I argue is directly counter to diversity. How this ideology is actually being implemented in schools and in social movements has been disempowering for many, and the way it limits thought and discourages curiosity. Elements that turned people from victims to survivors are grounded in individual agency, where circumstances didn't prevent people from succeeding. And the very idea of individual agency is marginalized by this ideology. It's erased and ignored by it. Instead, individuals and identity groups are encouraged to embrace small thinking, one way of being, feeling, and acting. And if we examine liberal victories throughout history, battles against bigotry, misogyny, homophobia, battles for freedom of speech, we're going to see that it took a diversity of thought and action. One way was not enough to defeat illiberal forces that sought to silence communities and erase individual agency. What was needed was actually diversity and inclusivity, not only bringing together racial or ethnically diverse groups of people, but people with different approaches, all working together towards a common goal. And I'll use an example of women's suffrage. There were women who were working on a national level, petitioning the federal government to recognize women's rights as US citizens. And then there were those that were going state by state. Those who excluded, there were groups of women that excluded Black women from the women's suffrage movement, and other groups who actually were advocating for suffrage of all women. And the pressure that this type of inclusivity builds is what worked to gain the rights of citizenship for women in the United States. What we're currently seeing is the antithesis to this. The direct impact that this is having on multi-ethnic and multicultural communities is that it encourages divisiveness. It forces one to choose one identity, one viewpoint, and erase and marginalize parts of oneself and one's community. And it's a bit ironic that an ideology that encourages thought, diversity, and that discourages thought, diversity, and inclusion found its way into learning spaces and progressive movements. And one way that the spread of this ideology is impacting the Black American community is by erasing the sacrifices made by our foremothers and forefathers. Entire pieces of our history, of our contributions to the United States, are minimized by critical ideology. Black American students are being encouraged to disavow heroes and role models that gave their blood so that we can enjoy the very freedoms that we live with daily. I believe Alina mentioned before, heroes like Thurgood Marshall and Rosa Parks are ignored from curriculum. They're erased from lessons because they don't fit into a narrative that's being peddled by liberated ethnic studies. Historical community partnerships, while not perfect and not without having conflict, they're completely diminished. There's been an effective attempt to drive a wedge between the Black American and Jewish American communities, for example, by certain groups that directly benefit from this divide through false solidarity movements. So my biggest concern really boils down to just the blotting out of history, canceling individuals and groups whose blood, sweat, and tears went into building our democracy.
Thank you, Randy. Alina, what do you think the larger problems are here?
Well, I think I want to get a little personal for a few minutes and share that my interest in this entire space, I think, is rooted in the fact that I'm an immigrant from the former Soviet Union. I emigrated at a young age. I emigrated at the age of 11, but by then the Marxist-Leninist indoctrination had already begun for me in school. And the language and concepts were essentially the same as the guiding principles that I was then witnessing in the initial drafts of the ethnic studies model curriculum. I ran this by some immigrants that immigrated as adults who absolutely confirmed, and then others. So they went through the curriculum, which, by the way, is not an easy task because they're almost 1,000 pages. So it does require some forbearance. Others, however, started to read it and said that it was just too traumatic for them to be rereading this content in its new iteration. So let's just sit with that for a moment. We're hearing from people that have lived this. And there was actually, I want to read to you from this heartbreaking plea, basically, from an immigrant petition that went to the California Department of Education after those drafts of the model curriculum for ethnic studies. And a portion of it reads, quote, "Never could we have imagined that decades later, the same ideology and concepts that we escaped would show up in, of all places, the California Ethnic Studies model curriculum," unquote. There's a reason that immigrants from communist countries are mortified by this type of, by the liberated ethnic studies curriculum. And this ranges from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, other Eastern European countries, to the Chinese, to Cuban, to Venezuelan immigrants. They have lived it. And the all or nothing, the us versus them approach is precisely the paradigm of communist totalitarian regimes, where students learn rhetoric that aligns with specific ideology. I actually, Jen, could you put up that slide with the roots and the circles for a moment? Just want to share something. This is a slide that is used in teacher training. I don't know if you guys can make out what it shows. So it's showing the roots as imperialism, and also in the center of the circle is settler colonialism. So this is teacher training for critical ethnic studies. All around the circles and also these various branches and leaves, you've got things that are equated, such as genocide, patriarchy, white supremacy. We've got private property, which stands in for capitalism, God, religion, and classism. That really says a lot right there. Thanks, John. One of my colleagues who lived through the Maoist Cultural Revolution that said why she's so passionate. I love her quote about why she's so passionate about keeping the CRT-based ideology out of the classroom. And the quote that really stuck with me was, "We had to be silent then, we won't be silent now." I want to tell you, just as an example, part of the reason that it's hard for people to understand what's happening basically right under their noses, although I think that we're starting to see more of an understanding, as evidenced by this conversation we're having right now, is that there are lots of code words. So we got critical hope, we've got radical healing, things that sound innocuous or even positive, right? The people that grew up in communist countries are used to code words and instantly recognize what's behind them. So for example, in those two, critical hope and radical healing, those are very fundamental critical race theory terms. They have to do with the overthrow and dismantling of a system. I want to give you an example of a guiding principle for ethnic studies from a critical ethnic studies curriculum. This is directly in as a principle. Connect ourselves to past and contemporary resistance movements that struggle for social justice on the global and local levels to ensure a truer democracy. So besides the resistance movements, the struggle, the emphasis on those, we also have the truer democracy, which, as it turns out, is a Marxist term for the elimination of private property. Code words. On the other hand, you can compare that to a constructive curriculum, where a principle would be to teach students about social justice, social responsibility, and to understand that they can become agents of change. So you can see that really fundamental difference between the two, and the impact. The way that this can be propagated in the classroom absolutely cannot be overstated in every classroom, in literally every subject.
Alina, while you're on the stage, I've got a question for you from the audience. The question is, who are the principal advocates of critical ethnic studies? How have they managed to exercise such power over curricular development and implementation?
So this is basically a great formulation of a question that is an important one to ask, which is, how in the world did this happen? How do we get to this point? It's just so completely nonsensical, right? In the case of ethnic studies, the answer to the first question, where do these people come from? They come from academia, they come from higher education. These are the folks that I alluded to at the beginning when I talked about scholar activists. These are people that see themselves, the activism part, as even more important than the scholarship part. To them, propagating a very particular notion, and they openly say that many of them will openly say they propagate neo-Marxism as an ideology. Not all. Many of the texts that they use will completely openly say that they propagate a specific ideology. So this ideology and this subject is quite prevalent on college campuses. In fact, I would say that almost all ethnic studies programs on college campuses are critical ethnic studies programs. These same professors have now started an entire business, basically, and a movement to push us all into K through 12. Now, how have they managed to exercise such power? I'm going to give a very abbreviated answer to that: because we have let them. We can go into detail of the history of how this happened, while there wasn't enough accountability and some systems failed, and so there were people that were nominated that were very heavily on the activist side, and activists are not supposed to be doing curricula, and how in the world did this happen? And then the California Department of Education did some hand wringing and said that, well, we'll put systems in place so it doesn't happen again. And then how's it continuing to happen? Well, because they insist, this critical ethnic studies movement insists that it's about ethnic studies in general, and it's way too easy to conflate critical ethnic studies with ethnic studies in general, is to say that, oh, well, if you don't approve of this, then that must be that you don't want ethnic studies and you are therefore a racist, when in reality what it means is you don't approve this very particular brand of ethnic studies. So that's another reason. But really, the bottom line is, how did it happen? Because we let it.
Yes, I want to ask this question posed by Darnell Samuels, and I think we can broaden it a little bit. What is the plan for change? Is it a matter of schools balancing their staffing with woke and non-woke teachers? How do we ensure that ideas get a fair hearing in our discussions in school? Maybe we'll start with you, Brandy.
I think that kind of going off of actually Alina's answer said that we let it is more involvement. So, and Alina, you can elaborate on this, but one of the requirements for the ethnic studies curricula that will be implemented in schools is to have public input and public knowledge. It's actually, transparency. And that means that in order to address it, community members need to show up in a respectful way, have a dialogue, show up in an organized way to actually be heard and make effective change. This isn't about coming in and causing a disruption. It's actually about gathering information and knowledge about what's going to be taught in our children's schools and getting the tools necessary to be an effective community member. And that's the beauty of living in a democracy and kind of, fighting to maintain our democracy, is that it necessitates active participation.
Mike?
David, sorry. Go ahead, Mike, and then I want
That is a tricky question, because from my perspective, a lot of things have been politicized, and people will get their first view from the kind of reactionary folks that are involved and loud and influential in this debate. So even just coming out with an answer that maybe that's CRT or maybe that's woke, oh, that's just a Fox talking point. And so it's difficult to sustain a public discussion with non-academics who don't actually read all of this, and have a medium in which a more casual discussion, but well informed, can be sustained and take place. There are folks in California that I've spoken with who come across as very political, and they're actually just common sense parents who want to have some say over what their students are taught in school. Fortunately, I had this with character counts, with social emotional learning, which is another battleground for the neo-Marxist influence, before that took place. And I looked at those to see what kind of social studies were taught in elementary schools, and those are now bending over to this new way of thinking. So it will take patience, and parents are going to have to get more involved, and we need to facilitate discussions at a non-academic level like this and get the word out. And I would also say that although I am nonpartisan and I want all of this to be nonpartisan, we shouldn't be afraid to having allies to the right or allies to the left, because we're talking common sense and rationality and logic, and that's what we need to stick to that discipline, and then we'll see our way through this.
Alina, I want you to probably end us with sort of what do we need to do, and you've started on that, but I wanted to add this question here, yet since it's such it's so apropos, where we are and where we need to go. So that's from Batsheva Frankel. Is there an actual constructive ethnic studies curriculum yet?
There are multiple ones, actually. So fortunately, and there have been all along. So constructive ethnic studies has been taught around California and around other states all along, which of course raises the question of why in the world did they need to create an entire curriculum that is on that is the CRT-based ethnic studies, but that's a question for another time. There are, in addition to being ad hoc all over the place, all over the country, there are constructive ethnic curricula that we know of that exist in the largest district in California. That's the Los Angeles Unified School District, the LAUSD. There are, Brandy actually recently has been reviewing a curriculum that is a constructive curriculum from another district in California called the Paso Robles District. A partner of ours called FAIR, Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, is in the process of delivering a constructive curriculum, a positive constructive curriculum. So there are absolutely options, and that's the part that provides opportunity. So we don't need to be arguing against something. We can be actually arguing for something. And that's a really positive thing to what Brandy was saying in terms of having these respectful and rich, robust conversations. We can be talking about the actual issues of what can we do. David, should I switch over to the specifics of what are the things that people can do?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let's see, John, could we go to the slide before last, just because I think it's easier for people to visualize some of this. And by the way, I glanced and saw there are lots of really great questions on there. I'm sorry that we are not getting to those, but I love the questions, and I really encourage you to email us. I think Jen put the
which slide, Alina? Were you
the next one? Actually,
the
let's
next
go
one?
to
Okay.
the next one. Hold on, and maybe even the one after that.
This one?
No, keep going. Keep going. There we go. Nope, one before that. There we go. Okay. So things that you can do. number one thing that I think you're hearing a theme across the board is get involved in some way. Don't care what way, just get involved in a way that feels right to you. We have recently published an ACEs Toolkit Guide to Action. So you can actually go to our website and navigate to the toolkit, which will give you a whole variety of steps you can take depending on where your interests lie, from as a parent approaching teachers and administrators and board members yourself, to mobilizing those around you. Numbers are key. So when we talk about how can we affect change, it's going to be through numbers. It's going to be through people speaking up and getting to a critical, so to speak, mass in order to push back on what's happening. So go to the ACEs Toolkit, check out what you can do, and you'll also see a whole bunch of talking points that will help you kind of get up to speed and know how to talk about these issues. Write letters to the editor, op-eds to local papers, national papers, anywhere. Get the word out. There's a very fundamental principle here, which is that we want to shine a big, giant light on it. So honestly, I'll tell you, our strategy as ACEs is really pretty simple. It's expose and mobilize. So expose what's going on, shine a light on it, and get more and more people to know about it. Go to school board meetings. You don't need to be a parent. Anybody can go to school board meetings to stay informed. Ask your administrators, ask your teacher, ask administrators, ask school board members, what kind of ethnic studies are being taught, and ask to see the materials. You'll get pushback sometimes. That's okay. Keep going, keep pushing against the pushback and powering through it. But get the information and then spread the information. If you're willing to get on a school board or a district curriculum committee, that's great. Those have a lot of voice in what happens in curricula. Talk to other parents, talk to your neighbors, talk to teachers, talk to everybody you can to spread the word. And if you still have no idea how you'd like to get involved, please let us know. Let us know even if you do have an idea. And we would love to provide you with opportunities that were hopefully right just for what you're looking for.
Wonderful. Jen, you want to wrap it up?
Oh, thank you, everyone. I think I've got the share off there. I think we ought to leave on an upbeat note with the information that we'll share also here. It was already shared in the chat of the ACEs Toolkit. Thank you so much for providing that, Alina. And hopefully this is the first of many other conversations. Thank you, Mike. Yeah. Thank you, Brandy.
Thank you,
everyone.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.